Welcome, night wanderers, to another after-hours adventure through the museum. Except tonight, our gallery is less about marble busts and more about busting beauty myths. Picture this, you and I gliding past the glass cases, the lights dimmed, and in the corner, an exhibit labelled Medieval Glow-Ups when looking ill was in. Before we step into the strange, ambitious, and sometimes eyebrow-challenged world of medieval beauty, do me a favour. If you find yourself grinning, nodding, or just plain baffled at any point, hit that like button and subscribe. Also, drop your city and time zone in the comments. I'm dying to see which time travellers are joining us and from where. Alright, let's dim the torches, hush the echo of our footsteps, and start our stroll back in time together. Now, in the Middle Ages, pale skin wasn't just a look, it was a signal flare of wealth and privilege. Think about it. Today we have bronzers, spray tans, and influencers chasing that sun-kissed glow. But in 14th century Europe, the goal was to look like you'd never so much as opened a window. Tan skin equaled outdoor labour, and outdoor labour meant you were probably milking something that wasn't a silk-spinning worm. Paleness, on the other hand, screamed, "I'm so important. The sun is not allowed to touch me." But they didn't just want a gentle porcelain complexion. They wanted skin so pale it was almost luminous. We're talking about a look so light, so ghostly, you'd half expect them to be allergic to light itself. Imagine a face so pale that even the moon would feel a little self-conscious. Of course, nature is rarely so accommodating, and if you happen to be cursed with healthy circulation, you had to get creative. Enter the world of medieval cosmetics. Noble women, and sometimes their male counterparts, would dust their faces with white lead powder, the original death by makeup routine. You'd smooth on this chalky concoction, walk away with a face like a pearl, and as a bonus, shave a few years off your life expectancy. Some folks went the extra mile, soaking cloths in vinegar to bleach their skin, or smearing on a paste made of crushed pearls and egg whites. The effect? A complexion that looked as delicate as a snowdrift, and probably felt about as appetizing as last week's omelette. But why stop there? If your veins were visible, you'd accentuate them with a dab of blue pigment, painting on your own roadmap of nobility. Delicacy and fragility were in fashion, so the more you looked like you might faint at the sight of a strong breeze, the better. Medieval poets took note too. Romantic verses compared women to milk, snow, or, my personal favourite, the winter moon. Nothing says ravishing like being described as on the verge of a fainting spell. This ghostly aesthetic wasn't just about being pretty. It was a social language. Pale skin meant you were pure, refined, and most importantly, not out there wrestling cows. If you could afford to be fragile, you were winning at medieval life. Achieving these ethereal looks required more than just commitment. It took nerves of steel and a tolerance for ingredients that would make your modern dermatologist faint. Let's talk lead powder. Yes, lead. The stuff we now panic about if it's even in a pipe, much less on our faces. In medieval times, this was the go-to foundation. The process? Combine vinegar and metal, let it fester like an alchemist's pet project, and grind it into a fine powder. The result? Skin so matte and pale, it would make a porcelain doll jealous. The downside? Chronic fatigue, skin ulcers, and a complexion that, if it started flaking off, meant you were doing it right. Of course, one product was never enough. Mercury-based rouge, chalk dust, and a layer of egg whites for that signature glazed finish. If anything could be found in a barn or behind a suspicious curtain in the apothecary, someone smeared it on their face. The result was dazzling, at least until it wasn't. Because, as every medieval beauty enthusiast soon discovered, lead and mercury aren't exactly skin-friendly. But if the alternative was being mistaken for a labourer, well, nobility was prepared to risk a little casual poisoning. And don't think the men were immune to this parade of peril. In the courts of Europe, image was everything. Male courtiers sometimes joined in with their own powders and potions, trying to look just as refined, if not quite so ghostly, as their female counterparts. If you were close to the throne, you wanted your skin to be smoother than your rival's political manoeuvring, and ideally, you wanted to smell less like the cheese course at a banquet. Now, let's raise a glass, or maybe even a tweezer, to one of the most jaw-dropping, or should I say brow-dropping, beauty trends of all time, the cult of the high forehead. Medieval Europe decided that the higher and more uninterrupted your forehead, the more elegant, intelligent, and let's face it, otherworldly you were. Think of it as the architectural marvel of the face, a forehead so expansive you could host a jousting match up there. To achieve this look, women went to truly wild lengths. Eyebrows, plucked, waxed, or just banished altogether. Hairlines, meticulously pushed back, sometimes by removing strips of hair from the scalp itself. This was not a trim, it was a full-scale expansion project, the medieval version of a home renovation, except the home was your own head. The methods were, shall we say, inventive. Tweezers, hot cloths, and depilatory creams made from ingredients that sound like they were drawn at random from a witch's bingo night. Cat dung, quicklime, or even vinegar-soaked leeches, all in the name of a forehead that could double as a medieval runway. The portraits from this era are something to behold. Serene women, faces glowing, foreheads vast and undisturbed, as if their features had simply drifted north for the winter. Fashion didn't just stop at the face. Tight-fitting hoods, wimples, and the famous cone-shaped hennons all worked together to emphasize this look, framing the face and pulling the hairline ever higher. If you were a noble woman from England, France, or Italy, odds were you spent a fair bit of time and pain achieving that high dome aesthetic. Artists and poets were all too happy to reinforce it, lavishing praise on faces that started somewhere near the crown. Of course, not everyone could dedicate hours to the plucking arts, so some women got creative. They draw in a new higher hairline and hide the rest under headbands or cleverly draped veils. It was medieval contouring, minus the bronzer, and with a lot more fabric. And let's not forget the recurring theme here. Eyebrows were the enemy. In the 14th and 15th centuries, a bold brow was seen not as a feature, but as an obstacle to true facial elegance. Eyebrows weren't just ignored, they were actively erased. Medieval beauty guides instructed women to pluck, shave, or even dissolve their brows using mixtures that included quicklime, vinegar, or for the truly committed, arsenic. Yes, you heard that right. If your routine didn't risk mild facial melting, were you even trying? Art from the era confirms the trend. Illuminated manuscripts and oil portraits alike show women gazing out with smooth, expressionless foreheads and eyes framed by nothing but skin. The effect could be serene or just a little bit uncanny, depending on the lighting. Interestingly, the no-brow trend wasn't universal. In some regions, especially where Middle Eastern or Byzantine influences crept in, thin or lightly arched brows managed to hang on, but for most of Europe, the message was clear. If your eyebrows were visible, it was time to up your game. Even men, especially those angling for a place near the court, sometimes trimmed or shaped their brows, though total removal was rare, unless someone lost them in a particularly heated theological spat. So what does all this tell us? Medieval beauty wasn't about looking natural, but about looking curated, symbolic, and just a little angelic. And if you've ever noticed that angels in medieval art seem to have smooth, browless faces, well, maybe it's not such a coincidence after all. They might not have had TikTok, but they had plenty of ways to set trends, erase features, and occasionally their own lifespans. Beauty, it seems, has always required a bit of suffering. Now, as we leave our gallery of ghostly foreheads and eyebrow casualties behind, get ready to pivot to the next stop on our magical museum tour. Because in the Middle Ages, beauty wasn't all about looking like you'd faint at a strong draught. Sometimes, a little blush could go a long way, and hair, minus sompt, whether shown off or hidden, was a canvas for ambition. In the next chapter, we'll dive into blushing, blonde ambitions, and the fine medieval art of concealing hair. In the Middle Ages, having a touch of colour in your cheeks was desirable, but that's a story for our next illuminated display. Let's slip through the next gallery door, where the walls are lined with portraits of medieval Europeans trying desperately to look both innocent and just a little bit scandalous. Blush in the Middle Ages was a delicate business, desired but fraught, like eating the last piece of bread at a monastery dinner. A hint of colour in your cheeks was the social equivalent of having a good credit score. It meant youth, fertility, and a certain hardiness, which was especially attractive if you managed to keep it up after the age of 28. But there was an important caveat. You could not, under any circumstances, appear to be trying. The ideal look was a gentle, natural flush, as if you'd just heard a slightly risque ballad, or taken a brisk walk in the garden, but not so brisk that your complexion veered into peasant territory. And absolutely no tan lines. Sun-kissed was not a thing. Too much effort, and suddenly you were accused of vanity, which was a gateway sin according to the ever-watchful church. The clergy took a strong stance. Painting your face was not just a mild faux pas, it was a slippery slope to moral ruin, unless you happened to be a noble woman, or you claimed your rouge was applied with all due humility. Medieval theologians would tie themselves in knots trying to define the difference, and the answer, as always, depended on who your uncle was. Still, women were nothing if not ingenious. They foraged for colour in gardens and kitchens, dabbing beetroot juice or crushed strawberries onto their cheeks. Mulberries lent a moody shade, while the bravest among them reached for cochineal, a crimson pigment born from the crushed bodies of insects. Yes, real bugs, because apparently the pursuit of beauty has always been a little bit horrifying. For those lacking access to the exotic or the squishy, a good hard cheek rub was the original no-makeup makeup. Some experimented with red ochre or even the sediment left at the bottom of a wine jug, all applied with whatever was handy, and ideally not still greasy from last night's stew. Of course, if you were wealthy, you could afford more dramatic options. Red lead or cinnabar, both of which were alarmingly toxic. But the logic was, I may not live to see old age, but at least I'll go out with the most admired cheeks in the parish. Application was an art in itself. Tools ranged from bits of cloth to bare fingers, and mirrors were a rare extravagance. Most women relied on muscle memory, instinct, or if fortune smiled, an honest maid who would risk eternal damnation to tell you if your face had gone from youthful glow to accidental clown. The trick was to never let your blush announce itself. Too much pigment, and suddenly you were lumped in with the less respectable professions, or, in a fate almost as bad, mistaken for a French courtier. The horror. It was all about subtle enhancement, not bold statements. If someone admired your complexion, the proper response was to blush harder and mutter something about the wind or a recent prayer session. Even nuns, those paragons of piety, occasionally succumbed to a discreet dab of rouge, strictly for feast days, of course. Because apparently, nothing says devotion quite like a careful touch of beetroot behind the cloister doors. Now, let's pivot to the medieval obsession with hair, which was, quite literally, a crowning glory. If your locks didn't look like they'd been blessed by celestial light or pilfered from a choir of angels, you were already starting at a disadvantage. Blonde hair in particular was the era's gold standard, symbolizing youth, virtue, and, if you needed extra validation, the Virgin Mary herself, who artists inexplicably depicted as flaxen-haired, geographical accuracy be damned. So if you were born with natural golden tresses, congratulations were in order. You were regarded as divinely favoured, and probably managed to avoid some of the less glamorous chores. The catch? Blondness faded with age, so medieval women became part-time alchemists. Kitchens doubled as beauty labs, with recipes calling for saffron, chamomile, wood ash, honey, and even lye. The most dedicated would slather their concoctions on, then sit outside and sunbask, a method that required the patience of a saint and the skin resilience of a salamander. Some formulas suggested urine as a secret ingredient. Whose urine? That depended on how desperate you were for that heavenly shimmer. But if the end result glowed, nobody dared ask. Beauty, as history consistently proves, is not for the squeamish. Hair texture was equally loaded with meaning. The medieval ideal was loose, long, wavy hair, tumbling down one's back like the world's most impractical tapestry. But don't get too comfortable. This look was reserved strictly for unmarried women. Once wed, your golden mane was no longer for public consumption. Suddenly, your hair was considered a moral hazard, and it had to be rigorously concealed under veils, nets, and wraps, as if you'd just inherited state secrets. For noble women, these coverings became playgrounds for creativity. Hair was braided, twisted, and tucked into elaborate knots, especially for court appearances or religious ceremonies. Accessories abounded, silk ribbons, beads, and embroidery, because nothing says I have servants like a braid studded with pearls. Meanwhile, men weren't left entirely out of the follicular spotlight. Knights with thick golden hair charging into battle were immortalized in poetry and art, the medieval equivalent of shampoo commercials, slow-motion hair flips and all. Hair, like wealth, was something you didn't flash around unless you were in the market for a spouse. Unmarried women were encouraged to let their hair flow as a symbol of innocence and purity, but only within certain bounds. Too much loose hair, and you risked looking like a wild forest maiden. Acceptable only if you were a saint or about to be martyred. Otherwise, a modest braid kept things respectable. As soon as vows were exchanged, though, your hair was banished under layers of cloth tighter than a monastery's wine budget. Welcome to the world of veils, wimples, nets and quiffs, a medieval wardrobe of modesty that could make even the most radiant blonde vanish beneath 3 layers of beige linen. These head coverings were more than just symbols of virtue. They were practical, shielding hair from smoke, lice and the wandering eyes of troubadours with questionable intentions. The most diligent layered their coverings, a snug coif as the foundation, a veil draped over that, and finally a wimple wrapped securely beneath the chin. The final effect? You looked like a pious, well-bundled sandwich, which was in fact the point. But as with all fashion, function soon gave way to flair. Veils stiffened into improbable geometric shapes. Nets were embroidered with gold thread. Some noble women even encased their braids in silken cages, adorned with jewels and the occasional tiny bell, because nothing says discretion like jingling when you turn your head at court. The connection between covered hair and morality was deeply ingrained. A concealed head was the gold standard of modesty, while exposed hair on a married woman could see you compared to a woman of ill repute, or, even more damning in some circles, a French woman. Naturally, some rebelled. A carefully curled tendril might slip out, or a veil might be sheer enough to hint at the golden glory beneath, a technicality that satisfied both the letter and the spirit of medieval fashion law. Medieval loopholes, it seems, were alive and well. Stepping back from the diorama, you can almost hear the whispers, admiration, envy, and a touch of scandal, all tangled up in strands of hair and swirls of rouge. The lengths to which people went in pursuit of beauty, and the labyrinth of rules they navigated, are a reminder that the past was every bit as complicated, contradictory, and occasionally absurd as the present. Now keep your eyes peeled as we head over to our next exhibit, where the ideals of beauty move from hair and cheeks to the rest of the medieval body. If medieval beauty had one unspoken rule, it was this. If you want to understand the medieval mindset, start with this simple maxim. Nobility is measured in vertical inches, at least above the eyebrows. By the late Middle Ages, European women were in the throes of a beauty arms race, and their secret weapon was the hennin. Picture a conical tower perched on your head, soaring up to 2 feet high, silk and velvet gleaming, and you're only slightly exaggerating. The hennin was less of a hat and more of a status update. Think of today's influencer heels, except the danger was less twisted ankle and more accidental impalement on a doorframe. These gravity-defying wonders were usually crafted over wire skeletons, then draped in the most sumptuous fabrics the family vault could afford. A diaphanous veil would flow from the pointed tip, billowing behind its wearer like a medieval superhero cape, albeit one tragically susceptible to open flames. Now you might be wondering how anyone got their hair under these architectural marvels. Well, enter the era of the disappearing hairline. Women plucked and shaved their foreheads so ruthlessly that some began to resemble very elegant eggs, because the higher the forehead, the higher your social standing, or so the logic went. Getting your locks to fit meant elaborate braiding, stuffing, and sometimes simply removing the problem altogether. One can only imagine the communal sigh of relief when the fashion for hats that doubled as siege weapons finally faded. But the hennin was just the beginning. For those who found the single spike too subtle, there were heart-shaped escapons. Imagine 2 buttery croissants glued to either side of your head, forming a perfect, if impractical, valentine. Then there was the butterfly hennin, where veils arched out like delicate wings, perfect for making a dramatic entrance, and absolutely terrible for a windy afternoon. The only thing these designs didn't do was keep you dry. Of course, not everyone aspired to become a walking bell tower. Beyond the gilded halls of the nobility, most women stuck to simple veils, linen caps or circlets, much less likely to catch fire or be mistaken for the latest in siege technology. The clergy, as ever, looked on in horror, warning that such ostentation was an express ticket to vanity, sin, and possibly traction for your neck. But as with all dangerous trends, the risk only made them more appealing to those with the means to indulge. Men, naturally, had their own ways of showing off. While they stopped short of donning giant cones, they weren't above a little drama. Feathered caps, fur-lined hoods, and the ever-dubious pointy shoes, some so long and curled they'd make a fencing master jealous, were all the rage. If your shoes could double as dueling equipment, you were doing medieval fashion right. Let's step back from the accessories and look at the medieval body ideal. Forget athleticism, forget curves, and definitely forget muscle tone. The goal was to appear ethereal and almost too delicate for this world, as if you'd spent your life subsisting on honey water and the occasional sigh. If you looked faint, ideally mid-swoon, you were doing it right. The perfect figure was willowy, with a narrow waist and soft, gentle curves, but not so slim as to suggest actual illness. It was a balancing act between looking like you'd survived the winter and looking like you'd just finished a very long prayer. Medieval dresses did their part to create this illusion. Gowns were cinched just below the bust, mimicking what we'd now call an empire waist, drawing the eye upward and elongating the torso. If nature didn't cooperate, tightly bound kirtles and chemises could add a little extra drama. Early shapewear, if you will, but with a much lower chance of fainting in a Pilates class. Corsets wouldn't arrive for another few centuries, but that didn't stop enterprising tailors from lacing everything within reach. But beware, being too thin was not the goal. In a world where famine was a seasonal sport, obvious skinniness was a red flag. A touch of roundness, especially in the face and hips, signalled health, fertility, and an ability to outlast the next bad harvest. If you looked like you could recite poetry by candlelight and still shovel snow come January, you struck the perfect balance. Diet advice from medieval beauty experts was, let's say, ambitious. Fennel for digestion, rose petals for fresh breath, wine for glowing skin, and protein only if it still came with feathers. This was less a nutrition plan and more a scavenger hunt. No one recommended building strength or stamina. The only lifting required was a coyly raised veil, ideally followed by a timely swoon. Meanwhile, men could carry a little more bulk, so long as it was artfully distributed. Broad shoulders, well-shaped legs, and the ability to swing a sword without toppling were all desirable. Still, the nobleman's ideal stopped short of actual muscle. Think less powerlifter, more long-distance poet. Refinement and posture mattered more than brawn, because nothing says eligible like standing very straight while reciting a ballad. Now let's talk facial features, starting with the eyes, windows to the soul, and occasionally the only part of your face visible behind several feet of hat. Medieval poets waxed rhapsodic about large, clear, soulful eyes, the kind that seemed to carry the collective weight of original sin and a touch of rain. Light-coloured eyes, especially blue or grey, were revered in Northern Europe for their suggestion of purity and innocence. In Southern Europe, dark eyes had their own mystique, especially when paired with a handsome dowry and a surname with more syllables than vowels. Enhancing those peepers was tricky business. Without liquid eyeliner, women resorted to charcoal soot, risking a look best described as accidental raccoon. A dab of black powder could make the eyes seem larger, but also risked irritation, blurry vision, and the world's first unintended smoky eye. Most women relied on candlelight and strategic glances. Want to look mysterious? Stand near a flickering candle and gaze downward, as if pondering eternity, or at least the dinner menu. Tearful eyes were oddly fashionable. A hint of moisture was interpreted as emotional sensitivity, piety, or maybe just a reaction to being stuck in a smoky hall for 3 hours. If you needed to look especially virtuous, a quick exposure to some incense smoke or a poignant poem could do the trick. Eye contact was a social minefield. Too much and you risked being labelled bold or, worse, French. Too little and you seemed shifty. The art was in the occasional upward glance from beneath lowered lids, as if you'd read the Psalms but didn't want to brag about it. And now for a topic rarely covered in troubadour ballads, the breath. Knights might sing about lips like rosebuds and teeth like pearls, but they were careful to avoid mentioning what happened when those lips parted after breakfast. In truth, medieval dental hygiene was more theory than practice, and minty fresh meant standing next to the herb garden and hoping for a strong breeze. Still, a sweet-smelling mouth was technically desirable. A gentle, pleasant breath hinted at youth, health, and the unlikely possibility that you hadn't just eaten garlic and pickled herring for your morning meal. Women chewed parsley, fennel seeds, cloves, cinnamon sticks, and the occasional twig, not for flavour but for self-defence. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of gum, minus the bubble-blowing competitions. For the well-connected, apothecaries offered herbal pastes and rinses made from sage, vinegar and myrrh. These were used sparingly, both because they were expensive and because opening one's mouth in public was borderline scandalous. Toothbrushing as we know it wasn't a thing. Instead, people wiped their teeth with cloth, rubbed them with chalk or crushed herbs, or gnawed on chew sticks, fibrous twigs that doubled as anxiety relievers during awkward courtship rituals. Bad breath wasn't romantic, but it also wasn't shocking. Everyone had their own unique bouquet, and there were far bigger problems to worry about, like surviving the winter or avoiding charges of heresy. Noble women learnt to minimize the risk. Conversations happened at a respectable distance. Public displays of affection were rare, and when in doubt you fanned yourself thoughtfully and gazed into the distance. Extra style points if you carried a tiny pomander, a scented orb filled with herbs to gently waft in your own direction when the situation got dire. So, as we wander through our gallery of medieval beauty standards, towering hats, heart-shaped hairstyles, waists cinched for the gods, and a healthy dose of rosewater and self-restraint, it's clear that the pursuit of perfection was as complicated, contradictory, and occasionally hilarious as it is today. Fashion was a balancing act between spiritual virtue, social ambition, and the ever-present danger of spontaneous combustion. But if you think that's peculiar, just wait until you see how they handled hygiene, scent, and the moral dilemmas of beauty. In modern times, a great smile can launch 1,000 dating apps, but in the Middle Ages, it was just one more thing to worry about, right after making sure your hat didn't block the cathedral door. Step into the next wing of our magical after-hours museum tour and brace yourself. We're about to stroll through the medieval hygiene gallery, a place where even the bravest knights would hesitate to draw breath too deeply. Now, in our world, a dazzling smile can spark 1,000 dating profiles, but in the Middle Ages, flashing your teeth was a bold move, somewhat akin to walking into a royal court and announcing, "Guess what I just ate?" Dental care was less a routine and more a desperate hope. Teeth were essential, of course, but mostly for surviving bread, so dense it could double as building material. By age 30, most mouths were a gallery of questionable relics, some slightly discoloured, others actively trying to escape. So the less you revealed, the better. Don't get the wrong idea. This wasn't pure negligence. Medieval diets centred on bread, porridge and mead, with nary a toothbrush or a hint of dental floss in sight. Sugar hadn't yet stormed the European kitchen, but plenty of starches were quietly converting themselves into plaque and misery. Even without candy, your teeth stood little chance. And if you needed a tooth pulled, medieval dentistry was equal parts exorcism and minor demolition, with pliers that made blacksmiths shudder. Despite all this, a healthy set of teeth was quietly admired, just not celebrated with open-mouthed grins. Being seen with a mouthful of white, straight teeth was like showing off a winning lottery ticket. Rare, envied, and a little suspicious. Medieval art gives us the best clue. Portraits show lips pressed together in polite restraint. Even saints and angels keep their mouths sealed, as if they too were wary of revealing a medieval molar. The reigning fashion was a demure, closed-lip smile. Think, "I'm pondering a sonnet," not "I've just won a free tankard of ale." Some women did attempt DIY tooth whitening, using sage, salt, or exquisitely ground coral. These powders were somewhat effective, but also abrasive. Imagine brushing with beach sand, telling yourself it's exfoliating. Teeth were tolerated, not flaunted. Troubadours sang of eyes that dazzled and hair like spun gold, but never breath that could wilt roses. Men didn't escape scrutiny either. The ideal medieval man was a paradox. Tall, lean, broad-shouldered, and above all, effortlessly noble. You wanted to look ready for a joust, but also capable of penning a melancholy poem about it, without ever breaking a sweat. Actual muscles were fine, so long as you weren't caught using them for anything as common as manual labour. A chiselled jaw, high cheekbones, and a straight nose were in vogue. Beards or clean-shaven faces were both acceptable, as long as they looked deliberate and not like you'd just wandered out of the forest. Hair was usually shoulder-length and attractively arranged, sometimes even curled with heated rods or treated with herbal rinses. Because nothing says I'm above the peasants quite like spending an hour getting your fringe just right. Clothing turned the male silhouette into a statement. Padded shoulders, cinched waists and fitted tunics sculpted the body, while posture was everything. A nobleman did not slouch. He glided with the poise of someone who has never lifted a sack of turnips. The ultimate look was born noble, the medieval equivalent of being attractive without trying, except the gym membership was replaced by an estate and a falcon. Now, let's talk about scent. Because if you think medieval Europe was a land of fragrant meadows, you're in for a surprise. Bathing was an option, not a requirement, and indoor plumbing was a distant Latin dream. Instead, odour management became an art form, less cloud of perfume, more personal force field. People did bathe, but not with the frequency we'd hope, and certainly not with the urgency of someone who owns a calendar. Bathhouses were popular in some eras, but plagues and church disapproval could put a damper on communal scrubbing. Enter the scented arsenal. The star of the show was the pomander, a small ornate metal orb, worn on a chain or pinned to a gown, stuffed with strong-smelling herbs like cloves, rosemary, cinnamon, sage, and the mysterious powder of roses. Think of it as the medieval world's answer to the scented air freshener. Portable, decorative, and absolutely essential. Imagine wafting through a crowded hall, your pomander swinging like a fragrant defense grenade, battling the oncoming tide of unwashed humanity. Nobility took their aroma game up a notch with perfumed gloves, scented handkerchiefs, and even combs imbued with oils. Hair could be rinsed in floral water or vinegar infusions, achieving a scent marginally better than damp wool and determination. The battle against sweat was ongoing. Line and underlayers helped absorb moisture and could be washed more often than the heavy outer garments. Some overachievers tucked herbal sachets under their clothing, hoping to emerge from the day smelling like a distant relative of a garden, rather than a regular at the local tavern. Of course, dry bathing was a thing. This entailed wiping down with a cloth, then splashing on floral water and pretending you were as fresh as a May morning. It was the medieval version of using extra deodorant after skipping the gym shower. Optimistic, but mostly fooling yourself. Some truly committed souls kept flower petals in their shoes or scattered herbs in their bedding, determined to keep the illusion going at least until breakfast. But here's where things get interesting. Beauty in the Middle Ages wasn't just about looking good. It was morally loaded, a trait both admired and fraught with risk. Possessing a beautiful face could be seen as a mark of divine favour, a sign that you were blessed by God and unlikely to steal livestock. Clear skin, symmetrical features, and a pale complexion were considered outward signs of inner virtue. Poets, preachers and painters alike described beauty as a window into the soul. But the line was razor thin. If you knew you were beautiful, or heaven forbid, used that beauty to your advantage, suspicion followed. Vanity was a sin, and showing too much interest in your appearance hinted at pride, seduction, or even worse, French tendencies. Sermons warned that a woman's beauty could lead men astray, which, naturally, was considered entirely her fault. Medieval Europe had a 1,000-year tradition of blaming Eve for everything from temptation to bad weather. A woman who wore makeup, revealed a bit of hair, or fluttered her lashes at the wrong night, could quickly find herself accused of everything from being immoral to being in league with the devil. Beauty could be seen as an illusion, a glamour cast by witches to deceive the righteous. This was a time when a bad harvest could get you burned at the stake, so imagine the hazards of being the prettiest girl in town. Meanwhile, being plain wasn't a ticket to safety. Those less blessed by nature were sometimes suspected of moral failings, illness, or simply being out of favour with the divine. The idea that your outer appearance reflected your inner worth was more than a passing notion. It was nearly doctrine. Beauty meant grace. Ugliness meant punishment or disappointment from on high. This left everyone in a constant state of anxiety. Be beautiful, but not too beautiful. Glow with virtue, but not enough to be accused of pride. And whatever you do, don't outshine the local lord's wife unless you're angling for a swift trip to the convent or a suspiciously convenient fever. So in the end, medieval beauty standards were less a set of guidelines and more a dangerous balancing act. It wasn't just about aesthetics. It was a full-blown moral tightrope walk, with vanity, virtue, and a dash of powdered lead, all fighting for centre stage. And with that, we closed the doors on the beauty and hygiene wing, where scent was a shield, smiles were secrets, and beauty was both a blessing and a curse, depending on who was watching. Now, as the perfume of rosemary and caution fades behind us, let's step into the next exhibit, where legendary warriors await. The Persian immortals were more than just elite troops. Step with me now into the heart of our after-hours gallery, where the lights flicker and the exhibit seem to breathe. Here, behind polished glass, stands a tableau that has mesmerized visitors and terrified would-be conquerors for centuries, the Persian immortals. But these were far more than soldiers. They were walking proclamations, 10,000 finely tuned instruments of imperial power, radiating discipline so intense it could make grown men reconsider their life choices. Their story begins in the echoing corridors of the Achaemenid Empire, forged under the watchful gaze of Cyrus the Great, around the 6th century BCE, when Persia was in the mood not just for expansion, but for grand gestures. Cyrus, ever the shrewd architect of empire, knew that bureaucracy alone wouldn't hold a kingdom together. No matter how many clay tablets you could cram into a library, you needed a force that would signal, in every language and dialect, that the empire was eternal. Enter the immortals, not just as a fighting force, but as a living, breathing monolith of Persian ambition. Let's pause for a moment, because the very name immortal wasn't a case of royal one-upmanship or an overzealous PR intern. It was, in fact, a masterstroke of psychological engineering. According to Herodotus, that most gossipy of Greek historians, the immortals were always kept at exactly 10,000 strong. If one fell ill, was wounded, or simply had a bad day and dropped dead, a replacement would slip seamlessly into the ranks. No gaps, no awkward pauses. Like a magic trick, the number never wavered. Outsiders, already unnerved by Persian efficiency, saw this as proof that the immortals could not be diminished. They didn't die, they simply reorganized. Clever record-keeping or supernatural feat. To the enemies of Persia, it made little difference. The legend took root and flourished. But let's be clear, this immortality had nothing to do with dodging arrows or sipping from the fountain of youth. It was the empire itself that remained undying, its spirit embodied in these 10,000 men. Each immortal was a thread in a vast tapestry, woven so tightly that to remove one was to see another appear instantly in his place. They weren't random draftees pressed into service after a particularly rowdy festival. To join the immortals was to be plucked from the ranks of the Persian, Median, or Elamite aristocracy, families whose loyalty was as prized as their bloodline. If your cousin was prone to treason, or your uncle had a gambling problem, well, best not to apply. Training began before most boys had even learned to tie their sandals. Picture a young noble, breakfasting on flatbread and dates, already dreaming of the day he'd done the shimmering scale armor of the immortals. But this was no summer camp. The discipline was relentless. Every day began before dawn, with silent drills in the pale morning light. Weapons were maintained with the fastidiousness of a modern car collector, armor polished until it shone like the sun rising over Persepolis. Meals were communal, practical, and always calculated for maximum endurance, meat, bread and wine, but never so much that anyone got too comfortable. Luxuries were strictly for the king. If you wanted to indulge, you'd have to do it in your dreams. Their identity was forged in this crucible of obedience. The immortal was not a man, but a role, one that required the dissolution of self. Personal ambition was not just discouraged, it was actively stamped out. If you started getting ideas above your station, the formation would gently but firmly remind you where you belonged. The unit moved as one. Individuality, that prized Greek ideal, was treated here like an infectious disease. The immortals prized unity above all. Now let's step closer and examine their uniforms. This was not the world of Greek hoplites, all bronze and braggadocio. The immortals were clad in robes of breathtaking beauty, embroidered tunics and trousers, dyed in royal hues of crimson and purple, proclaiming their status before they even drew a sword. Beneath these sumptuous layers lay a flexible coat of scale armor, bronze or iron depending on the era, designed to move with the body, offering both protection and agility. Their shields, made of tightly woven wicker, may have looked dainty at first glance, but could absorb the impact of arrows and club strikes with surprising resilience. Their most distinctive flourish, The felt tiara, a soft cap sometimes drawn low to obscure the face, lending each immortal an air of inscrutable menace. Imagine facing not one, but 10,000 nearly identical figures, faces shadowed, eyes unreadable. It was a calculated effect. Where the Greeks celebrated the individual hero, the Persians conjured an army that looked less like men and more like a tidal wave of silent, unyielding will, a curtain of fate drawn across the battlefield. Each immortal carried a short spear, a powerful composite bow, and a razor-sharp short sword. Their arsenal was designed for maximum versatility. They could unleash hails of arrows from afar, then close in for brutal hand-to-hand combat. But the real genius lay in their ability to move, swiftly, silently, over any terrain. Marching across provinces, through sand, stone or snow, they never broke formation. Unlike many ancient armies, they could function equally well as frontline fighters or palace guards. It was about performance, yes, but also about spectacle. Persian kings knew that war was theatre, and the immortals were the empire's most dazzling act. When they appeared on campaign, drums thundered and dust billowed, but the men themselves moved in eerie silence, faces blank, steps synchronized, no wild war cries, no chest thumping, just 10,000 souls gliding forward like the slow, inevitable closing of a door. Immortals didn't blink. Immortals didn't retreat. Immortals endured, and in that word, endured, lies the secret of their terror. Their presence was psychological warfare at its most refined. The Greeks in their bronze might have looked invincible, but the immortals looked like inevitability itself. They were the heartbeat of an empire, pulsing always, never faltering. To be an immortal was to live under constant scrutiny. Every meal, every night's sleep, every conversation was watched by the state. The empire provided for its warriors, not out of affection, but to ensure that their loyalty was absolute. From the moment a recruit entered the ranks, his life was no longer his own. He belonged to Persia. Most immortals came from noble lineages, but there was room for the exceptionally disciplined to rise. If you could demonstrate utter obedience and the stamina of a camel, you might just earn a place. Training began in childhood, archery from horseback, relentless drills in pain and hunger, learning to march as though your life depended on it, because, frankly, it did. There was no room for glory seekers. Anyone who tried to stand out was swiftly corrected. The collective mattered more than the star. The immortal's daily routine was as rigid as a sundial. Up before dawn, drills in silence, weapons cleaned and oiled, armor checked, meals taken in unison. Theirs was a life designed for endurance. Indulgence was for the weak. The empire needed men who could move without complaint, fight without hesitation, and vanish into formation at a moment's notice. But life wasn't all marching and mayhem. When not campaigning, the immortals served as the king's personal guard. Their duties included intercepting assassins, keeping the peace among fractious nobles, and occasionally playing a starring role in royal ceremonies. Their mere presence could hush a dissenting voice at court. The king knew their discipline, and so did everyone else. They were the eyes and ears of imperial power, trained to spot a lie, sense a tremor of fear, and act without mercy. Contrary to some of the darker myths, the immortals weren't isolated from all traces of normalcy. They could marry, maintain households, and even raise children. But these privileges were always provisional. At any moment, duty could call, and when it did, even the most heartfelt family dinner would be abandoned without so much as a backward glance. Hesitation was not tolerated. If you faltered, you vanished, replaced with a new shadow, and the line remained unbroken. This was the real secret to their immortality, not invulnerability, but perpetual replacement. The system was cold, efficient, and unyielding. The legend grew not from their individual heroics, but from their relentless ability to reconstitute themselves. The immortals didn't just fight with discipline, they breathed it, wore it, lived it. They were instruments of empire, honed, polished, and sharpened until only duty remained. The immortals may have been conceived by Cyrus, but it was Darius the Great who elevated them to icons of statecraft. Darius, who came to power amid a swirl of intrigue and bloodshed, understood that legitimacy was as much about spectacle as swordsmanship. He paraded the immortals at lavish festivals, stationed them as living statues around the palatial heart of Persepolis, and sent them on missions that were as much theatre as warfare. Everywhere they went, they radiated the message: the empire is eternal, and its guardians are ever vigilant. Under Darius, their tactical role evolved as well. No longer just shock troops, the Immortals became the linchpin of Persian combined arms warfare. They fought alongside archers, cavalry, and charioteers, operating as part of a grand choreographed ballet of destruction. Darius demanded flexibility, and the Immortals delivered. Their training expanded to include siege warfare and complex battlefield maneuvers. Greek observers, who never missed a chance to sprinkle a little drama into their reports, described how the Immortals advanced in perfect lines, unleashing volleys of arrows while their shields overlapped in a seamless wall. The effect was mesmerizing and more than a little terrifying, but their duties weren't limited to open battle. As the empire stretched from Egypt to the edges of India, rebellions flared with predictable regularity. The Immortals became the king's scalpel, slicing through dissent in Babylon, Elam, and beyond. Their arrival in a city was both punishment and warning, a living reminder that the empire watched and remembered. Even their images were deployed as weapons. On the walls of Persepolis, you can still see the Immortals carved in endless procession, their faces stylized and identical, marching into eternity. These weren't portraits, they were propaganda, etched in stone to remind every visitor, friend or foe, that the empire's vigilance was ceaseless. It was under Darius that the Immortals took on a darker edge. They were not just warriors, but enforcers and executioners, symbols of both hope and fear. Their legend grew ever more formidable, often outpacing the reality of their battlefield achievements. This legend reached its fever pitch during the reign of Xerxes the Great, most famously at the narrow, blood-soaked pass of Thermopylae in 480 BCE. Now everyone loves a good underdog story, and Thermopylae is the original blockbuster. It pitted the relentless order of Persia against the scrappy defiance of the Greek city-states. At the centre of it all, the Immortals, poised as the vanguard of Xerxes' colossal army. As the Persian host descended on Greece, the Immortals were not just bodyguards. They were Xerxes' answer to chaos, his hand-picked weapon for shattering resistance. Their reputation preceded them. The Greeks whispered of the 10,000 who never died, the elite who guarded kings and crushed rebellion with the calm of a chess master moving a pawn. But at Thermopylae, myth met mortal resistance. King Leonidas and his band of Spartans, and let's not forget the thousands of less-filmed Greek allies, stood shoulder to shoulder in the cramped defile. When Xerxes unleashed the Immortals to break the Greek line, everyone expected an easy victory, but the terrain turned the Immortals' strength into weaknesses. Their bows couldn't arc above the close-packed phalanx, and their shorter spears couldn't reach past the razor-sharp Greek dory. For hours, the Immortals battered themselves against a wall of discipline as fanatical as their own. The losses mounted. Even Herodotus, never one to miss an opportunity for a dramatic flourish, noted that the Immortals fared no better than ordinary troops. It wasn't just a physical defeat, it was a crack in the myth. The Immortals, so long the stuff of nightmares, could bleed, could falter, could die. In that moment, the illusion of their invincibility shattered, pierced by Spartan resolve and Greek steel. Yet even as their legend was dented, their spirit endured. They adapted, regrouped, and pressed on. Because for the Immortals, immortality was never about never falling. It was about always rising again. So, as the echoes of bronze and the dust of history swirl around this exhibit, remember, the Persian Immortals were not just warriors. They were a concept made flesh, discipline, spectacle, and psychological warfare, stitched together into an unbroken line, the very pulse of an empire. Their legacy, however, doesn't end with the clang of swords or the silence after battle. There is more to discover as we step into the next gallery and examine the intricate system that sustained them, the slow unravelling of their legend, and the curious ways their shadow lingers even today. After all, the most fascinating part of the Persian Immortals wasn't just their training or battlefield tactics. Now, as we step deeper into the gallery, allow me to draw back the velvet rope and reveal the real secret behind the Persian Immortals. Yes, their training was brutal and their tactics legendary, but the true magic of the Immortals wasn't found on a battlefield or in a secret scroll. It was woven into the very machinery of the empire. Their so-called immortality was not a matter of sorcery or divine blessing, but of painstaking, relentless organization. Picture this: every time an immortal fell in battle, succumbed to illness, or simply aged out of service, his place was filled instantly. No fanfare, no public mourning, no poetic lament. The number was always exactly 10,000, not one more, not one less. And this was not just a pretty number for the poets. This was the iron rule of Achaemenid bureaucracy. The immortals were the empire's ultimate proof that you could in fact run the world on clipboards and spreadsheets. If your spreadsheets were written on clay tablets and managed by men who could order you executed for a typo, behind the scenes a steady supply of trainees and stand-ins, young men chosen for their promise, waited in the capital. They were drilled, disciplined, and rotated through the empire's less glamorous duties, ready to step into the ranks at a moment's notice. Every vacancy was anticipated, every transition seamless. The immortals were less a fighting unit and more a living, breathing system, a perpetual motion machine of excellence and control. Their records were kept with obsessive care. 10 officers, each known as a Hazarapati, commanded 1,000 men apiece, and under them sprawled a complex lattice of sub-commanders, scribes, and quartermasters. These officers tracked not only who wielded which spear, but who was due for new sandals, whose rations needed adjusting, and whose mother had started making suspicious remarks at the market. Lose a man patrolling the Nile? A replacement was dispatched from Susa before the sun set. A soldier sprained his ankle chasing bandits in Media. His successor was already tightening his sandals and humming a marching song. The machine never missed a beat. But the genius of the system wasn't just logistical, it was psychological. The immortals were engineered to be more than mere soldiers. They were a living myth, an unbroken line of warriors who never seemed to die. If you struck one down, another appeared. Identical in bearing and dress, it was as if you'd just lopped a head off the world's most elegant hydra and found yourself facing the same serene, unblinking gaze. Their individuality melted into the uniform of the collective. The man behind the spear was irrelevant. It was the presence, the spectacle that mattered. To the conquered and the restless, the immortals were a warning. The empire does not grieve, does not falter, does not forget. If you rebel, the answer will arrive not as chaos, but as a silent, silk-draped replacement, already in formation. This machinery extended into every corner of imperial life. Even off the battlefield, the immortal system never slept. If an immortal's family fell under suspicion, maybe a cousin started chatting up rival nobles, or a brother-in-law was caught muttering about taxes, he could be removed with the same impersonal efficiency. No trial, no rumour, no scandal. The line closed, the ranks filled, and the empire's face remained unchanged. This was not the ancient Greek way, where glory was a personal affair, and heroes' deaths were the stuff of epic poetry. The immortals were the anti-heroes of the ancient world. Their strength was not in singular deeds, but in the terrifying, impersonal certainty that they could never truly disappear. Yet to imagine the immortals as mere automatons is to miss half the story. Yes, they were warriors, but they were also diplomats in lamellar armour. The Achaemenid understanding of power was subtle. Military might was not just about shock and awe, it was about being seen, about presence. The immortals often accompanied ambassadors to foreign courts, not as bodyguards, but as living, breathing emblems of Persian grace and authority. Imagine 10 men moving in perfect synchrony, gliding into a Greek or Babylonian city, not covered in grime and scars, but dressed in soft tunics, shot through with gold thread, their weapons gleaming, their faces unreadable beneath soft felt headdresses. They didn't threaten, they didn't boast. Their silence was their message. To witness the immortals was to understand, at a glance, that the empire was watching, and that resistance was a very bad idea indeed. In the far-flung satrapies, the presence of a squad of immortals was a potent deterrent. They rarely meddled in the affairs of local governors, but everyone knew their true purpose. They watched, they listened, and if whispers of sedition grew too loud, it was the immortals who came knocking. Most rebellions died in the cradle, smothered by the mere possibility of facing these silent professionals. Even in the heart of the royal court, the immortals' roles were layered and ambiguous. On festival days and state occasions, they performed as ceremonial guards, their discipline and splendor on full display. Behind the scenes, they were the king's eyes and ears, sniffing out treason, enforcing loyalty, and reminding ambitious courtiers that the hand of the empire was never far away. Some scholars argue that the immortals functioned as a kind of ancient intelligence agency, spies with very sharp swords and a keen sense of timing. Their dual identity, warrior and envoy, enforcer and ornament, was a masterpiece of imperial design. Where other elite units lived for the roar of battle, the immortals understood that power could be exercised without ever drawing a blade. To be seen was often enough. Awe and fear became two sides of the same coin, and the coin was always stamped with the king's face. Their mere arrival in a distant palace sent a shiver down the spine of local rulers. The immortal's presence was a message, delivered in gold and silk. The king is everywhere, and his reach is endless. Sometimes the greatest wars are won with nothing but perfectly timed silence. But as with all things imperial, the gears of the immortal machine began to grind down over time. Empires age, and so do the systems that sustain their legends. In its twilight years, the Achaemenid Empire still fielded immortals who inspired fear and respect, but their aura of invincibility had begun to tarnish. The bureaucracy that once hummed with ruthless efficiency now creaked under the weight of complacency and court intrigue. As Persian kings drifted away from the realities of war, choosing instead to drown themselves in luxury and the politics of the palace, the immortals themselves started to change. They became less the empire's sword and more its golden ornament. By the reigns of Artaxerxes and Darius III, the immortals still dressed the part and still marched in time. But something vital had slipped. Recruitment standards, once rigid, now bent under the pressure of political favours. Nobles manoeuvred to place their sons in the sacred 10,000, regardless of merit. The result was a prettily polished shell, empty of the spirit that had once animated it. Uniformity remained, but the living heart of discipline began to sputter. When Alexander the Great swept into Persia in 334 BCE, the immortals were fielded in defence of Darius III at Gaugamela. They fought bravely, but against the tactical brilliance of Alexander's Macedonian phalanx, they were outflanked and overwhelmed. The legend cracked. For centuries, the immortals had been an unbreakable thread in the Persian tapestry. Now, on that dusty plain, the thread finally snapped. The system of instant replacement that had once hidden all losses faltered. The backup squads weren't ready. The machinery stuttered and then failed. Alexander entered Persepolis and found not a living legend, but a hollowed-out empire. The immortals were gone. The unbroken line had been broken at last. But in the grand tradition of legendary institutions, the immortals' story did not end with their defeat. Their shadow stretched far beyond the ruins of Persepolis. Alexander himself admired Persian customs and adapted elements into his army, blending the myth of the immortals into his own legend. Centuries later, the Sasanian Empire would field a new elite guard, sometimes called the Immortals by later historians. These new units were not direct descendants, but the echo of the old myth persisted, 10,000 strong, fiercely loyal, the embodiment of imperial will. Even in their fall, the Immortals left a blueprint for the ages. They demonstrated how to build not just an army, but a narrative, a weaponized legend. Their influence seeped into the imaginations of kings, generals and storytellers alike. The Persian immortals vanished from the battlefield, but their shadow lingered in every myth of unbreakable elite guards, from Roman praetorians to Napoleon's imperial guard. Their legend endured not because they won every fight, but because they stood for something larger, the ideal of state power, endlessly renewed, faceless, and eternal. To the Greeks, the immortals were a riddle wrapped in silk. Herodotus, never one to pass up a good story, called them immortals, not because they could not be killed, but because you could never see them die. Their replacements appeared with supernatural speed. Their numbers never wavered. To the Greeks, who were used to wars of chaos and personal glory, this was unnerving, almost inhuman. The immortals were not men, but an idea made flesh. Roman scholars in later centuries still recalled the structure of the Persian elite guard with a mixture of envy and admiration. Even Byzantine chroniclers, who had their own imperial guards to brag about, couldn't resist invoking the old Persian model. As the centuries rolled on, the legend only grew. Early Islamic historians wrote of the 10,000 who had once protected the ancient kings, their spears flashing like a field of silver beneath the desert sun. The Sasanian elite cavalry, sometimes dubbed the New Immortals, carried the torch into late antiquity, their mission unchanged, to embody invincibility, to radiate imperial presence. Napoleon himself, centuries later, pored over Persian military treatises and praised their organizational genius. In time, the Immortals seeped from history into myth, and from myth into modern imagination. Today they are often portrayed as masked fiends, monsters, or shadowy assassins in pop culture. But the reality was, if anything, even more remarkable. The Immortals were not born otherworldly. They became legendary through sheer, relentless human discipline and the power of an idea. Their greatest weapon wasn't a sword or a spear. It was the certainty that they were always coming, always watching, always ready to replace the fallen and close the ranks. They became an eternal shadow on the edge of the known world, a lesson in the alchemy of bureaucracy and myth-making. And so they endure, carved into stone at Persepolis, etched into military manuals, and whispered in the legends of those who know that true power, the kind that lingers long after the last spear has fallen, is built not just on strength, but on the illusion of unbroken presence. And as we quietly step away from the Immortals display case, a shimmering vision of silk, bronze, and unyielding order, our magical tour leads us toward a very different kind of warrior legend. Because before there were Greek stories of Amazons, there were the Scythians, nomadic riders whose ferocity and elegance swept from the Black Sea all the way to the Alai Mountains. Let's meet the women who made even hardened immortals look twice. Step into the dimly lit wing of our magical gallery, where the spotlights flicker on, and suddenly you're surrounded by the thunder of hooves, the creak of leather armor, and if you listen closely, the unmistakable sound of arrows slicing the wind. Here, the legends of ancient warrior women aren't just stories tucked away in forgotten scrolls. They're the centerpiece, living and breathing, ready to challenge everything you thought you knew about who swung swords and who stayed home. Let's start on the endless grass ocean of the Eurasian steppe, where the Scythians roamed like storm clouds, nomadic, unpredictable, and utterly terrifying to anyone foolish enough to get in their way. Now, if you're picturing a camp of burly, bearded warriors while their wives knit socks by the fire, think again. In Scythian culture, the women didn't watch from the sidelines. They mounted their horses, strung their bows, and rode out to battle alongside the men, sometimes in front of them. This wasn't some rare exception, whispered about in the marketplace. For the Scythians, it was business as usual. Gender roles on the steppe had as much flexibility as their composite bows. Everyone learned to hunt, to ride, and when necessary to kill. Greek travellers like Herodotus arrived expecting polite, domesticated women, and instead found entire tribes where marriage proposals were less about candlelit dinners and more about body counts. According to his rather wide-eyed accounts, a Scythian woman was expected to have slain at least one enemy before she could even think about settling down. At first, those stories sounded like the fever dreams of a travel blogger who'd had a little too much fermented mare's milk. But then came the archaeological mic drop. Across Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and southern Russia, burial mounds, known as kurgans, have been unearthed, yielding skeletons of young women armed to the teeth. We're talking bows, arrows, swords, and armor, not to mention the kind of battle scars you definitely don't get from sewing. One particularly haunting grave revealed a woman with an arrowhead lodged between her vertebrae, her spine forever marked by combat. Her armor and grave goods were not the ceremonial kind. They were worn, battered, and real. She didn't just hold these weapons, she used them, and she paid the price. Life on the steppe was a relentless test of survival, demanding resilience and adaptability from everyone, man, woman, or adolescent. Girls learned to draw a bow almost as soon as they could walk, their hair braided in the same warrior styles as their brothers. On horseback, with tattoos swirling over sun-browned skin and leather armor hugging their frames, Scythian men and women were nearly indistinguishable as they charged together in battle. Gender might have meant something in the yurt, but once the arrows flew, it was skill and grit that mattered. This fusion of roles was as natural to them as breathing. A woman could storm the battlefield at dawn, then return to preside over rituals or raise children by dusk. These weren't mutually exclusive identities. They were two halves of a whole. The Greeks, who'd never seen such a thing, turned these living warriors into myth, and the Amazon legend was born. But where the Amazons of legend faded into fantasy, the Scythians carved their place in recorded history. They fought the Persians, harried the Greeks, and even gave Alexander the Great's Macedonians a run for their money. For centuries, the steppe echoed with the hoofbeats of men and women who made war together. But let's leave the wind-ripped grasslands for a moment and travel south, to the lush forests and royal courts of West Africa. Here, in the kingdom of Dahomey, modern-day Benin, another legendary sisterhood took shape. The Agoge, known to the French as the Dahomey Amazons, weren't inspired by Greek myths. They were the real deal, and their reputation made European colonizers sweat through their uniforms. By the 1700s and 1800s, the Agoge had become the king's personal guard. But calling them mere bodyguards is a bit like calling a tornado a gentle breeze. Some say they started as elephant hunters or palace attendants, but history watched them evolve into an elite fighting force. Young girls, often chosen for their strength, spirit, or simply because they refused to back down in a fight, were recruited and separated from their families. Once inducted, there was no turning back. Training was brutal. Imagine running through obstacle courses studded with thorns, sparring with real blades, and swearing loyalty to the king and to celibacy. They wore braided sashes, carried muskets, machetes and clubs, and learned that the most dangerous weapon was sometimes a cold, unflinching stare. European observers, expecting to see women in ceremonial roles, instead found themselves watching night raids and ambushes led by the Agoge. One particularly shaken French officer described seeing a Dahomey Amazon rush forward, slit a man's throat, and then nonchalantly wipe the blood from her blade as if she were cleaning her glasses. These women were not symbols. They were shock troops, leading the charge in battle after battle, especially during the brutal Franco-Dahomean wars of the 1890s. Outnumbered and outgunned, the Agoge didn't flinch. They launched night raids, executed ambushes, and fought for every inch of their kingdom, often forcing the French to question not just their tactics, but their entire worldview about women and war. Yet the true impact of the Agoge went far beyond the battlefield. In a world that carved out every inch of power for men, these women seized their own space with steel and resolve. They advised kings, shaped policy, and performed ceremonial duties, not hidden behind palace walls, but front and centre, blades at their sides. Even after Dahomey fell to the French, the legend of the Agoge refused to die. In fact, their fierce spirit inspired the fictional Dora Milaje of Marvel's Black Panther, proving once again that real history can outshine even the boldest comic book fantasy. Now let's glide across continents and centuries to feudal Japan, where the air is thick with war drums and cherry blossoms. Out of the swirling mists rides Tomo Gozen, a figure who seems almost too formidable to be real. But she was no legend. She was a samurai of the late 12th century, fighting in the Genpei War, a brutal civil struggle that birthed Japan's first shogunate. Tomo wasn't content to be a decorative presence in the war camp. She was a commander and a warrior, as skilled with a bow as she was with a sword, and her name alone could make grown men rethink their life choices. Her story, immortalized in the Heike Monogatari, a war epic that blends history with a poet's flair, describes her as a woman of striking beauty, with pale skin, long hair, and features that could have inspired 1,000 love poems. But don't get distracted by the aesthetics. The very next lines remind us that her beauty was matched only by her ferocity. She was a master archer, a swordswoman worth 1,000 men, and a leader whose presence on the battlefield was anything but ornamental. Tomo Gozen served under Minamoto no Yoshinaka, her lord and Binus according to some rumors, her lover, during his campaign to seize Kyoto. But she wasn't there to patch wounds or fetch tea. She led troops into battle, wielded her own blade, and left a trail of defeated enemies in her wake. At the Battle of Owazu in 1184, as Yoshinaka's forces faced certain defeat, Tomo didn't slip away under cover of darkness. Instead, she leapt straight into the chaos. In one of her most legendary moments, she supposedly unhorsed a charging enemy, wrestled him to the ground, and beheaded him with a single decisive stroke, then calmly remounted her horse and galloped back into the fray as if it were just another Tuesday. Was this story embellished by the chroniclers, or did it really happen as described? No one can say for certain, but the image of Tomo Gozen, composed, deadly and utterly unflinching, has endured for centuries. And what happened to her after the dust settled? Here, the trail vanishes into rumour. Some claim she was captured and forced into marriage. Others say she abandoned the world and became a nun, seeking peace after so much violence. Still others believe she simply vanished, a warrior ghost lost to history, her fate forever a mystery. Yet Tomo's legacy endures in theatre, folklore and the Japanese imagination. In a society that prized rigid gender roles and male authority, she was the exception that refused to disappear. Blade drawn, head held high, she demanded the right to exist on her own terms, no matter how many times the world tried to write her out of the story. And so, as we walk past these living dioramas, Sikthian archers, Dahomey Amazons, and Tomo Gozen, remember that these women weren't footnotes or fantasy. Their cultures didn't just tolerate them, they celebrated them. They didn't merely survive, they reshaped their worlds, one battlefield at a time. But the story doesn't end here. As we cross into the next gallery, the shadows grow longer, and the stakes get even higher. In the 1st century CE, the Roman Empire was at its peak. But on the edge of its vast dominion, other women, Boudica, Cutalune, and Joan of Arc, were about to lead rebellions that would shake the world to its core. Let's step forward and see how defiance was redefined, one uprising at a time. Step into our next gallery. Spotlights flicker on, illuminating 3 figures dripping with both legend and grit. And if you listen closely, you might hear the faint clatter of chariots, the stomp of wrestling boots, and the clang of swords against plate. Welcome to the Hall of Rebellion and Resistance. Our first exhibit, a towering woman with a mane of wild red hair, eyes like storm clouds, and a gold torque gleaming at her throat. This is Boudica, queen of the Iceni, and a woman who taught the Roman Empire that humiliation is a dangerous game. Picture Britannia in the 1st century CE, a patchwork of tribes stitched together under Roman rule, bristling with resentment. Boudica had every reason to play along. Her husband Prasutagus was a so-called client king, allowed to keep his tiny throne if he played nice with the imperial overlords. But when he died, Rome tore up their agreement like a bad contract. Roman bureaucrats swept in, seized the kingdom, whipped Boudica in front of her people, and minus according to the historian Tacitus, committed atrocities against her daughters. The message was clear: submit or be broken. Instead, Boudica ignited. Think of her as a human wildfire. In 60 or 61 CE, she rallied tribe after tribe, not just the Iceni, but neighbours who'd spent centuries squabbling over sheep and boundaries. Suddenly, they had a common enemy, and Boudica was the spark in their gunpowder. She didn't take the role of figurehead. No, Roman scribes describe her at the front, riding a chariot with blades whirring from the wheels, hair streaming behind her, spear aloft, her voice booming across the chaos. She wore a flowing tunic, practical for battle, dramatic for legend, and that massive gold torque, a statement necklace if ever there was one. Her army swept through Camulodunum, now Colchester, raising it like a bonfire of Roman vanity. Then came Londinium, the future London, where her warriors hunted down colonists and set the city ablaze. The numbers are staggering. Estimates say over 70,000 Romans and their allies met their end in a matter of months. The Roman invincibility was reduced to ashes and terrified whispers. But Rome was nothing if not stubborn. Governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, a man with a name almost as long as his patience, regrouped his battered forces. Outnumbered but never out-organized, the Roman legions lured Boudica's army into a pitched battle. Roman discipline was like a spreadsheet against the Celts' wild fury. The result? Devastation. Boudica's rebellion was crushed. Facing defeat, she chose death on her own terms, some say by poison. Her final act was to deny the Romans the satisfaction of parading her in chains. Roman chroniclers tried to paint her as a barbarian scourge, but even they couldn't deny her raw courage. In later centuries, Boudica's legend only grew. For the British, she became the patron saint of sticking it to the man, whether that man wore a laurel wreath or a powdered wig. Move with me now, past the scorched banners and twisted spears, to the windswept steppes of Central Asia. Here the golden age of the Mongol Empire is in full swing, And in the middle of it all stands Cthulhun, a woman who made warlords nervous and princes rethink their life choices. She's not your typical princess, unless your idea of royalty is someone who can suplex you into the next century. Cthulhun was born around 1260, daughter of Kaidu Khan, cousin to the great Kublai Khan. Her childhood was a crash course in archery, horsemanship and military strategy, but her real claim to fame? Wrestling. Among the Mongols, wrestling was as honoured as battle itself. Cthulhun wasn't just good, she was legendary. She issued a challenge to every suitor: beat me in a wrestling match and you can marry me. Losers, however, had to forfeit horses, money, or livestock. The results were as predictable as a medieval reality show. Dozens of hopefuls, all confident in their masculinity, were promptly thrown into the dirt by Cthulhun's iron grip. The horses alone, legend says 10,000 of them, would have made her the envy of any nomad, not to mention the world's most intimidating stable owner. Her suitors slunk away, bruised in both ego and body, while Cthulhun's reputation soared. But this wasn't just sport. She rode into real battles at her father's side, charging into the fray and breaking enemy lines. Kaidu valued her so highly, he considered naming her as his heir, an unprecedented move in a culture where leadership was a boys' club. Predictably, the Mongol nobles balked. Whispers spread that Cthulhun's strength was unnatural, her ambition dangerous. In the end, Kaidu relented and picked a male successor. Still, her legend refused to fade. Even Marco Polo, wandering through the empire, recorded tales of a Mongol princess who could outfight, outride, and outshoot any man in the steppe. Later storytellers tried to domesticate her legacy, turning her into a lovesick maiden or a mythical footnote. But the real Cthulhun was a force of nature, a woman who set her own terms for power, marriage and wealth, and made the world bend around her. Now let's slip through the next gallery arch, where the air is heavy with incense and the echo of distant church bells. Here stands Joan of Arc, a figure both luminous and tragic, cast in the silver light of legend. Imagine 15th century France, battered by the 100 Years' War, its fields trampled, its people weary. Into this world stepped Joan, a peasant girl from Domremy with no noble blood, no formal education, and absolutely no patience for the rules. By 17, Joan had somehow convinced battle-hardened knights and skeptical clerics that she was on a mission from God. She claimed to hear voices, saints like Michael, Catherine and Margaret, telling her to lift the siege of Orleans and crown Charles the Dauphin as king. The court subjected her to weeks of interrogation, grilling her about her visions, her faith, her choice of trousers. Somehow she passed. They saw something in her, fervour, charisma, or maybe just the kind of conviction that can't be faked. Clad in gleaming white armour, her banner embroidered with lilies, Joan rode to Orleans at the head of an army. French commanders rolled their eyes at first, but Joan's presence electrified the troops. She didn't just lead from behind, she was in the thick of the fight, rallying soldiers, braving arrows, and charging straight into danger. Against all odds, the siege was broken. Orleans was free, and Joan became a living symbol of hope. Her victories didn't stop there. She escorted Charles to Reims, where he was crowned king, just as her voices had foretold. But glory is a fickle friend. Joan's rise made enemies as quickly as it won admirers. In 1430, she was captured by Burgundian allies of the English. Her trial was a farce, accusations of heresy, witchcraft, and, most scandalous of all, cross-dressing. At 19, Joan was sentenced to death. She faced the flames in Rouen marketplace, defiant to the end. Her execution was meant to erase her, but instead it made her immortal. Years later, the church would clear her name. Centuries on, France would make her a saint. All three women, Boudica, Cthulhun, Joan, set their own terms and paid the price. They were painted as monsters or miracles, depending on who held the pen. But their legacies are proof that resistance is as much about rewriting the rules as it is about breaking them. As we leave this gallery, the echoes of rebellion linger in the air, mingling with the scent of scorched earth and the distant clang of armour. But our journey isn't over. The torch passes on to new legends, some celebrated, some nearly erased. By the time Nakano Takeko took up her naginata, a bladed polearm favoured by samurai women, Japan was changing fast. As our footsteps echo through the twilight-lit gallery, the next diorama flickers into life, a swirling blend of lacquered armor, swirling banners, and a flash of steel. Here stands Nakano Takeko, poised and unyielding, her naginata gleaming like a crescent moon poised to cut through the fabric of history itself. It's the late 1860s in Japan, and the world she knows is vanishing fast. The samurai class, once the backbone of Japanese society, is dissolving, swept away by the relentless tide of modernization. But Takeko, born in 1847 to a family steeped in scholarship and martial tradition, refuses to let the old ways go gentle into that good night. From the time she could barely reach the training mat, Taiko was immersed in the Confucian classics, perfecting her brushstrokes, but most of all mastering the art of fighting. The naginata, a weapon with both reach and elegance, was her chosen companion. It wasn't just practical for close-quarters battle, it carried centuries of symbolism, a badge of the samurai woman. Under the stern but proud gaze of her adoptive father, himself a renowned martial arts instructor, Takebo honed her skills until she could match any man in the dojo. By her 20s, she'd crossed the line from student to master, teaching other women not just how to wield a sword, but how to carry themselves like warriors. But when the Boshin War erupted in 1868, pitting the forces of the crumbling Tokugawa shogunate against the modernizing imperial regime, Tako didn't stay behind to write poetry or pour tea. She joined the defense of Aizu, the last stronghold for those clinging to the old order. Officially, women weren't supposed to take up arms. Unofficially, Takeko had other ideas. She pulled together a band of women fighters calling themselves the Joshitai, the Women's Army, each one armored, determined and ready to step into the fray. Picture them for a moment. Hakama trousers billowing, armor plates catching the morning sun, naganitas at the ready. They fought, not on the sidelines, but shoulder to shoulder with the men, defending home, family, and a vanishing way of life. At the Battle of Aizu, Tako's unit clashed with imperial troops equipped with rifles, a clash of eras embodied in the crack of gunfire against the hiss of a razor-sharp blade. According to those who witnessed it, she cut down several opponents before a bullet struck her in the chest. Even mortally wounded, Tako refused to surrender to fate. Fearing dishonor in death, she asked her sister to sever her head so that her enemies couldn't claim it as a trophy. Her body was laid to rest at a temple in Fukushima, her beloved naginata by her side. Today you can still find statues of Nakano Takeko in Japan, especially in Aizu. She's remembered not just as a warrior, but as the last defiant echo of a world that refused to bow to modernity, to patriarchy, or even to the certainty of death itself. With a wave of my curator's hand, the lights dim and the scene shifts. Now we're standing amid the frost-bitten trenches of World War II's Eastern Front. Here, the spectre that haunted German soldiers wasn't a ghost from legend, but a flesh-and-blood woman, Lyudmila Pavlichenko, the sniper the Nazis called Lady Death. Her legend wasn't conjured by propaganda or spun from rumor. She was very real, and her enemies feared her for good reason. Born in 1916 in what is now Ukraine, Pavlichenko was competitive from the start, sharp-witted, fiercely patriotic, and with a natural gift for marksmanship. When the Nazis stormed into the Soviet Union in 1941, she was just 24, a university student with a passion for history. The Red Army offered her a safer path. Why not become a nurse, they suggested. Pavlichenko declined, opting instead for a rifle. She was sent to the front lines, first at Odessa, then at the brutal siege of Sevastopol, where her legend truly took shape. Imagine her there, motionless for hours on end, camouflaged so thoroughly she seemed to merge with the icy landscape, waiting for the perfect shot. Her prey included officers, machine gunners, and even enemy snipers. With nerves of steel and a determination that bordered on the supernatural, Pavlichenko's confirmed kill count climbed to a staggering 309, including 36 rival snipers. Her prowess was so formidable that eventually Soviet command pulled her from the front and sent her on a diplomatic mission to rally support in the United States, Canada, and Britain. During her tour, she met President Franklin D. Roosevelt and developed a rapport with Eleanor Roosevelt, who admired her self-possession and intelligence. When reporters tried to sideline her with questions about makeup or skirt lengths, Pavlichenko fired back with the kind of wit that left no doubt she was as sharp with words as with a rifle. After the war, she didn't fade into the shadows. She completed her degree, became a historian, and trained the next generation of Soviet marksmen and women. Her trauma and injuries lingered, but so did her legacy. Today, medals and monuments honor her as a national hero in both Russia and Ukraine. In a world that has always doubted a woman's place on the battlefield, Lyudmila Pavlichenko never argued. She simply outperformed almost everyone who ever lived. Yet for every Nakano Takeko or Lyudmila Pavlichenko, there are hundreds, maybe thousands, whose names never made it into the history books. History, after all, is often written by those who hold the pen, and for most of recorded time, those hands have belonged to men. When women picked up weapons, be it swords, rifles, or spears, their stories were rarely celebrated. Sometimes they were erased entirely, other times reduced to legend or dismissed as fantasy. But the truth is, women warriors have always stood on the front lines, across continents and centuries, their silence less a choice than an imposition. Take the Trung sisters of Vietnam, Trung Trac and Trung Nhi, who in the 1st century led a rebellion against Chinese domination. They rode into battle atop elephants, rallying thousands to their cause, and ruled an independent kingdom for 3 years before being overcome by overwhelming Chinese forces. Even now they are venerated in Vietnam, their memory kept alive in temples and festivals, yet, outside their homeland, their names barely register, a footnote in the global narrative. Or consider Yar Asantewar of the Ashanti Empire in West Africa. In 1900, when the British colonial authorities demanded the sacred golden stool, the very symbol of Ashanti sovereignty, she refused to yield. As Queen Mother, she delivered rousing speeches and led her people into battle, embodying a defiance that transcended gender. Her leadership challenged more than colonial power, it shattered every expectation of what a woman was allowed to do. The gallery crackles with energy as we move past the Viking Age. Shield maidens, once dismissed as fairy tales, now stand vindicated by archaeological finds. Graves containing not only women, but their weapons, armor, and even war horses. These weren't mere tokens or ceremonial trinkets. They were the tools of warriors who fought and died on the battlefield, side by side with their male counterparts. In the sun-scorched canyons of the American Southwest, Apache women like Luozen rode into legend. Luozen, a spiritual leader and fighter, fought alongside her brother, Victorio, the famed Apache chief. Her presence seen as both a tactical advantage and a spiritual safeguard. Her story, like so many others, is a testament to the countless ways women have shaped the course of conflict, not merely as bystanders, but as active agents of history. Across every era and every region, women have fought, not always to conquer, but to protect their families, their land, their way of life. Some led armies, others fought as solitary figures in resistance movements. A few were queens, many more were peasants or outsiders, but all of them, in their own way, struck a blow against the fiction that war belonged to men alone. Today, their stories are crawling back from the shadows. Scholars, artists, and filmmakers are piecing together the fragments, rediscovering names, reclaiming legacies. For every woman whose statue stands in a public square, there are dozens more whose courage and achievements still wait for recognition. And each time another name resurfaces, it's a reminder that history is not just the record of what happened, but also the story of what was erased. These women never asked to be immortalized in legend. They didn't fight for glory or fame. What they demanded, often in the face of overwhelming odds, was something much simpler: respect. And now, at last, the world is starting to hear their voices, echoing down the corridors of time. As we leave behind the echo of clashing swords and the whispered names of forgotten warriors, the gallery's mood shifts once more, from the battlefield to a world where power took another form entirely. In the heart of ancient Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, music wasn't just entertainment. Step with me into our next shadowed gallery, where the air hums with the first true music of civilization. Flickering torchlight reveals the treasures of ancient Mesopotamia. Imagine modern-day Iraq, but with fewer traffic jams and a lot more gods to please. Here, music wasn't just a pastime for bored scribes. It was woven into the very fabric of ritual, authority, and the unspoken language between mortals and the divine, and nothing embodied this sacred power quite like the lyre. Not your average campfire guitar, mind you. The Mesopotamian lyre was one of humanity's earliest stringed instruments, appearing over 4.5 millennia ago in the bustling Sumerian city-states. Picture artisans painstakingly crafting these lyres from precious woods, then embellishing them with gold, silver, and glimmering lapis lazuli. Some were topped with animal heads so lifelike you half expect them to blink. The bull-headed lyre, unearthed by the indefatigable Sir Leonard Woolley in the 1920s, steals the spotlight here. Its body is shaped like a bull, sturdy and regal, with a head gleaming under a layer of hammered gold. Even its beard is fashioned from lapis lazuli, catching the light as if the instrument itself might begin to sing. But this wasn't just about showing off royal bling. The bull symbolized strength, protection, and a connection to the heavens. Its presence on the lyre was spiritual. Think less decoration and more celestial hotline. Played with nimble fingers or a small plectrum, the lyre produced a haunting resonance, a sound that seems to echo across centuries. We can't recreate the exact ancient tunes, but scholars have pieced together enough from weathered clay tablets to know the Sumerians used a 7-note scale, yes, the same number of notes as the Western scale that gave us Beethoven and Beyoncé. These tablets, inscribed with some of the earliest known musical notation, prove that even then, people were already thinking about music theory and the science behind those mysterious vibrations. Lyres didn't just fill palace halls with music. They followed priests and priestesses into the temple, providing the backdrop for prayers and offerings to gods like Inanna, the fierce goddess of love and war, and Enlil, the lord of wind. Picture hymns rising with the dawn, voices and lyre entwined, turning sound into a bridge across the mortal-divine divide. Lyres also marked the transition to the afterlife, their melodies guiding souls beyond the city walls. These weren't mere instruments, they were vessels of transformation, voices for the sacred moments when life and death brushed hands. The musicians themselves were no mere background players. Many were women, priestesses who learned complex songs by heart, their skills honed in specialized schools alongside scribes. Others were court musicians, their status elevated by the power of their music. Today, replicas of those ancient lyres still ring out in museum halls, the soft twang reminding us that the urge to chase beauty across vibrating strings is as old as civilization itself. Before there was Mozart, before medieval troubadours or Homer's sung epics, there were Sumerians plucking lyres in the desert, seeking the sacred in sound. But now, let's take a sharp turn, a literal breath of fresh air, as we slip into the wild, sun-drenched world of ancient Greece. Here, the music was anything but tame. Forget gentle harps, the Greeks gave us the arlos, a double-barreled wind instrument that didn't so much sing to the gods as shout at them. The arlos was no delicate flute. It was built for drama, passion, and occasionally a touch of chaos. Imagine 2 pipes, crafted from bone, wood, or ivory, each with its own reed and finger holes. The musician, cheeks ballooned to cartoonish proportions, played both pipes at once, unleashing a sound so intense it was closer to a bagpipe than anything you'd hear in a modern orchestra. The arlos wasn't for the faint of heart. Mastery required circular breathing, a feat where players inhaled through their nose while simultaneously squeezing air from their cheeks, creating an unbroken stream of sound. If you're picturing a Greek Kenny G, only with a lot more sweat and less smooth jazz, you're not far off. Athletes even poked fun at Awolo's players for their puffed-up faces, but secretly, everyone knew it took serious skill and tremendous lung capacity to keep up. But what really set the Awolo's apart was its raw emotional power. While the lyre symbolized harmony and balance, think Apollo, god of reason and order, the Awolo's was the instrument of Dionysus, the wild god of wine, ecstasy, and sacred madness. Its voice screamed, wept and danced, stirring the blood whether in a crowded theatre, a Bacchic ritual, or a march into battle. In Greek drama, the aulos set the mood, amplifying the highs and lows of tragedies and comedies alike. Its piercing wail accompanied soldiers as they marched, keeping hoplite sandals in perfect step, even as shields clashed and chaos reigned. And at festivals honouring Dionysus, its music sent dancers spinning into trance, blurring the line between mortal and possessed. Philosophers had opinions, of course. Plato, ever the party pooper, dismissed the aulos as dangerously emotional, preferring stringed instruments for their supposed intellectual purity. Yet even he couldn't ignore its power to command a crowd, to mimic sorrow, fury, or euphoria, sometimes all in a single breath. Today, fragments of these ancient instruments sleep in glass cases, but their modern reconstructions hint at a wildness that's impossible to fully tame. If the lyre whispered to the gods, the aulios howled at the moon. Now, with a swirl of incense and a shift in the gallery's soft lantern light, we find ourselves in the refined courts and scholars' studios of ancient China. Here, music was more than entertainment or emotional release. It was a living philosophy, a path to harmony within and without. And at the heart of this tradition sat two remarkable instruments, the guqin and the guzheng. At first glance they might look like relatives, long, elegant zithers resting on lacquered tables, but each carries a distinct voice and story. The guqin is the elder, an instrument with over 3,000 years of history. Picture a slender, fretless body strung with 7 silk strings, each note emerging as a gentle whisper or a shimmering harmonic. To the untrained ear, the guqin might seem almost too subtle, its music a hush of sliding tones and plucked notes that hang in the air like a question. But to Chinese sages and scholars, these sounds mirrored the balance of the cosmos, the dance between heaven and earth. Confucius himself was rumoured to play the guqin, believing it cultivated not just musical skill but moral character and inner alignment. In ancient China, learning the guqin wasn't about dazzling an audience, it was about becoming a better human. Next to the guqin stands its younger, flashier cousin, the guzheng. With 16 to 21 strings stretched over a curved wooden frame, the guzheng demanded attention. Musicians wore plectra on their fingers, plucking cascades of notes that tumbled like water over river stones. Where the guqin was private, introspective, almost meditative, the guzheng was public and dramatic, its voice singing out in palace banquets, folk celebrations, and even on the battlefield. Its sliding glissandos could mimic galloping horses, or the rush of a mountain stream. The guqin whispered to the soul, the guzheng sang to the crowd. Both instruments played roles in ritual, storytelling, and spiritual practice. The guqin accompanied poetry readings, philosophical gatherings, and moments of meditation. The guqin lent its voice to operas, feasts, and epic tales of love and war, its music transforming silk strings into rivers of emotion. Even the players themselves reflected the ideals of their culture. The guqin was typically the domain of male scholars, while the guzheng became associated with female performers, especially in later dynasties. Yet both commanded deep respect, taught in esteemed academies, and immortalized in Confucian texts as essential tools for a balanced education. Today, both instruments live on, bridging the ancient and the modern in concert halls and classrooms alike. Their music is a reminder that in China, the pursuit of beauty through sound was also a path to virtue and emotional depth. So, as we step away from the twang of desert lyres, the wild shriek of Greek orloi, and the contemplative sighs of Chinese zithers, remember, music in the ancient world was never just background noise. It was ritual, power, a way to shape souls and societies alike. And our tour through these galleries is just beginning. Because in the next wing, the music gets even more divine as we enter ancient Egypt, where every note was a message to the gods. In ancient Egypt, music wasn't background noise. Let's drift through the gallery's next wing, where the soft glow of torchlight reveals a world where music wasn't just for background ambience, it was a hotline to the gods. Imagine ancient Egypt, where every note carried a purpose, every instrument a message. In this corner, the Nile floods not with water, but with melody. Music here wasn't idle entertainment for bored nobles. It was the pulse of life, woven into every ceremony, every labour, every sacred rite. Picture yourself walking through the bustling markets or along grand temple corridors. You'd hear rhythms that soothed tired workers, melodies that guided souls to the afterlife, and songs that lured the divine down from the heavens. The instruments themselves were as varied and essential as the river's gifts. The Egyptian harp, one of the oldest around, stands tall in the exhibit, its frame once curved like a hunter's bow, later growing into a towering angular presence that could match a man in height. These harps weren't reserved for the idle rich. Temple musicians and court entertainers, fingers nimble as sparrows, would pluck their strings, sending ripples through both air and eternity. Harps show up in tomb art for a reason. They were believed to help shepherd the souls of the dead, providing a soundtrack for their journey to the afterlife. Think of it as the ultimate playlist for your trip to eternity. Now let's step over to a display that rattles with divine energy. Meet the sistrum, a sacred rattle, intimately tied to Hathor, the goddess who moonlighted as protector of music, motherhood, and joy itself. Crafted from gleaming metal, its loose crossbars clatter and jangle with every shake. Subtlety, not its style. Its sound was meant to cut through the mortal realm and catch the attention of gods and spirits. Priests and priestesses shook the sistrum to purify sacred spaces, banish evil, or keep cosmic order from unraveling. If you've ever tried getting a toddler's attention with a noisy toy, you're on the right track. Only this time, the goal was to impress the divine. Of course, wind instruments played their part in Egypt's daily and spiritual life. Imagine a parade, the air alive with the breathy notes of reed or bone flutes. These weren't just background music for a stroll. They marked processions and rituals, their melodies swirling around priests, dancers, and worshippers. The double clarinet, a show-off if there ever was one, featured two pipes played at once, buzzing together in a rich harmony. If you think that sounds tricky, you're right. It's a bit like trying to whistle and hum at the same time. Impressive, strange, and oddly mesmerizing. No ancient Egyptian gathering was complete without the steady pulse of percussion. Frame drums thumped, hand clappers clicked, and castanets snapped, their rhythms lifting dancers' feet and festival-goers' spirits. But here's where it gets interesting. Professional musicians in Egypt held true status. Many of them were women, immortalized in temple carvings as harpists and singers. These women weren't just background noise, they were priestesses of sound, chantresses of Amun, musicians of Isis, gatekeepers to both sacred and social realms. For a society so fixated on cosmic order, it's telling that women musicians could command such spiritual power. The Egyptians left us plenty of visual clues about their music, though their actual notation remains a tantalizing mystery. Unlike their neighbors in Mesopotamia or later Greeks, they didn't leave behind much in the way of written scores. Instead, we rely on the art tomb murals, temple reliefs, and buried instruments tell the story. It's clear that Egyptians understood music as a powerful blend of structure, emotion, and something a little bit magical. Even in death, music was never left behind. Elite tombs often included cherished instruments, their owners confident they'd need a harp or two for the field of reeds, the Egyptian version of paradise. In short, music was more than a pastime. It was the language of eternity, a passport for the soul. Let's glide further south across the gallery, where the air pulses with rhythm. Here, ancient Africa opens up before us, not through scrolls and records, but through the heartbeat of drums. Before paper, before parchment, African societies relied on something far more direct, rhythm as language. Across the continent, music wasn't just an art form, it was a living, breathing voice that carried laws, legends, and even royal decrees. Drums, in particular, were central to this sonic world, each one with its own dialect and personality. The West African talking drum sits proudly in its display case, hourglass-shaped and strung with taut leather cords. This drum is no ordinary percussion instrument. Skilled drummers could actually mimic spoken language, tightening the cords to change pitch mid-beat. Imagine standing in a village square and hearing a drummer send out a message, announcing a birth, a death, or perhaps the arrival of an important guest. It was the continent's first wireless messaging system, beating the postal service by a few millennia. But the drum's power wasn't just practical. In ancient kingdoms like Kush and Nubia, the drum was a spiritual channel, calling forth ancestors and deities. In places like Ife and Benin, drums honored kings, punctuated ceremonies, and sanctified rituals. Striking a sacred drum was believed to wake forces beyond the visible world, making the drummer less of a musician and more of a shaman. African drums came in a dizzying variety. The djembe, dundun, bugarabu, and kidi, each carved from a single log, hollowed and stretched with animal hide, each tuned for a specific role in the ensemble. Crafting these instruments wasn't just a matter of woodworking, It was a sacred act, often passed from father to son, with rituals marking every stage from tree felling to final tuning. And the soundscape didn't stop with drums. Rattles, bells, shakers, and even thumb pianos layered in rhythm and melody, creating polyrhythms so complex Western music wouldn't catch on for centuries. Music in African tradition was inseparable from movement. You didn't just listen, you danced, sweated, and lived the rhythm. The drummer didn't perform for an audience. He became a conduit, channeling communal memory and ancestral spirit. These rhythms traveled across continents, through desert caravans, along the Nile, and eventually, heartbreakingly, on slave ships to the Americas, where they seeded the roots of jazz, samba, and blues. But at their core, these beats always belonged to Africa, where music was never mere entertainment. It was identity, memory, and the echo of survival itself. Now, let's climb higher. The gallery's air thins and cools as we step into the Andes. Here, music floats on the wind, threading through stone cities and terraced fields perched above the clouds. In these ancient Andean civilizations, Nazca, Moche, Inca, music was a language of air and spirit. The main attraction? Aerophones. That's flutes, whistles, and, most famously, the panpipes, the siku. The siku looks deceptively simple, just rows of reed or bamboo tubes, each a different length, lashed together in a tidy row, or stacked in double tiers. But in the hands of a skilled musician, these pipes could conjure harmonies that drifted across valleys like a whispered conversation with the wind. Players would alternate notes between two rows, a technique known as hocketing. The result was a melody built from interlocking breaths, each note falling between the other. This wasn't just musical showmanship, it was a reflection of the Andean ideal of duality and balance, a sonic mirror of their worldview. Flutes were everywhere too. Some were small enough to string around your neck, others long enough to fill a mountain pass with sound. Many were carved into the shapes of birds, serpents, or spirits, each design hinting at the belief that music connected the living world with the supernatural. Andean instruments weren't just for entertainment, they were sacred tools used to call rain, bless the harvest, honor the sun, or commune with ancestors. One especially intriguing artifact is the whistling vessel of the Moche civilization, ceramic jugs that, when filled with water, forced air through a whistle as you poured. The result was a haunting, otherworldly tone, musical pottery merging water, air, and sound into a single ritual experience. In Inca society, music was everywhere. It accompanied births and funerals, military parades and agricultural festivals. There was a tune for every chapter of life. Musicians played for Inti, the sun god, and Pachamama, the earth mother, offering their breath as a form of devotion. Even soldiers marched to coordinated flute ensembles, transforming warfare into a sort of ritualized choreography, part battle, part ballet. Spanish colonization tried its best to silence these traditions, but the sound of Andean flutes has never truly faded. Even today, echoes of those ancient melodies drift through Peruvian highlands and Bolivian villages, a voice of stone, wind, and sky, still singing in the thin mountain air. And just like that, as the final breath of the panpipe fades, our magical gallery doors swing open to the next exhibit. We'll cross continents and centuries, following the trail of ancient music's legacy, because in ancient India, music was more than a performance. Let's step quietly into the next room of our magical gallery, where the air hums with a resonance so old it might just be the background music of the universe itself. Here, ancient India and Mesoamerica stand side by side, separated by oceans but united by one thing, the belief that music shapes reality itself. If you've ever argued about which playlist to put on at a party, imagine having to select the right song to keep the cosmos from unraveling. That's the level of pressure we're talking about. In the halls of ancient India, music wasn't mere entertainment. It was nothing short of cosmic architecture. The sages and philosophers of the Vedic age believed that the world itself was sung into existence by a single, eternal vibration, not a catchy pop hook, but the mother of all bass drops. Out of this primal sound, according to tradition, unfolded a labyrinth of melodies, rhythms, and rituals, each designed to mirror and maintain the harmony of the universe. Picture the priests, the Brahmins, chanting the Vedic hymns, known as samans, around a sacred fire. These weren't just recitations. Each syllable, each rise and fall in tone, was meticulously measured, as if a misplaced note might detune the very fabric of existence. The Brahmins trained for years in the art of voice modulation, learning to shape sound as carefully as a sculptor shapes marble. If you think your choir director is strict, try singing for a god who might smite you for being off-key. Out of this devotion to the perfect note grew a musical tradition that was both science and poetry. The earliest Indian instruments, like the veena, a stringed beauty with a resonating gourd at its base, weren't just tools for making music. They were symbols. The veena belonged to Saraswati, the goddess of wisdom and the arts, who was said to strum its strings to keep the universe in tune. Playing the veena wasn't just a creative act, it was an act of devotion, a way to tap into the cosmic current. Wind instruments too carried their own stories. The bansuri, a bamboo flute, was the instrument of Krishna, the divine trickster and heartthrob of Indian mythology. According to legend, when Krishna played the bansuri, even the wildest animals and most skeptical villagers couldn't help but dance. The flute's sweet, ethereal sound was believed to pierce Maya, the illusion of ordinary life, and lift listeners toward enlightenment. If only modern elevator music had such power. And then there were the drums, the mridangam and tabla, whose intricate rhythms, called talas, were more than percussive backdrops. They were mathematical marvels, echoing everything from the beat of the human heart to the turning of the stars. Some cycles were as regular as a clock, others as unpredictable as a toddler with a saucepan. Every rhythm was tied to rasa theory, which insisted that music must conjure up specific moods, joy, valor, tranquility, or heartbreak, like a playlist designed by an ancient therapist. The most astonishing part? Unlike so many ancient musical traditions that faded into silence, India's has not only survived but thrived, adapting and evolving over millennia. Yet at its heart, it still carries that same audacious idea that music is an act of communion with the divine, a way to align yourself with something much, much bigger than yourself. Now, let's stroll, or perhaps time warp, across the gallery to Mesoamerica, where music was just as powerful, but it was also a bit more likely to give you goosebumps, and maybe even make the hair on the back of your neck stand up. In the shadow of the pyramids at Teotihuacan, or the vast plazas of the Maya and Aztec cities, music was the very engine of the sacred. Here, music was not a gentle caress for the soul. It was a force, a technology, a key to the door between worlds. Imagine the heart of a festival, the air thick with incense and anticipation, as the huatal drum, tall, carved from a single tree trunk, its surface painted with gods and jaguars, begins to thunder. Bare hands slap the taut animal skin, sending vibrations shuddering through the stone courtyards. The drumbeat is relentless, a pulse that could either summon rain or terrify enemies depending on the occasion. It is, quite literally, the heartbeat of the gods. Next to it sits the tepanasli, a wooden slit drum, whose two carved tongues produce different pitches when struck with rubber-tipped mallets. The Aztec believed it could speak, its rhythms echoing the very names of deities or the secret patterns of fate. In a world without Spotify, the tepanasli was both radio and oracle, broadcasting messages to the heavens. Wind instruments here were wild and inventive, carved from bone, clay, or reed, often shaped to resemble animals or deities. Some flutes could mimic the calls of birds or the growl of a jaguar, blurring the line between music and magic. And then there's the infamous Aztec death whistle, a small clay instrument shaped like a skull, whose shriek sounds like a banshee on a bad day. Archaeologists suspect it was used to startle enemies or open doors to the spirit world during rituals. If you're looking for the original heavy metal, this is it. Music in Mesoamerica wasn't a pleasant diversion. It was woven into every life event: births, coming-of-age ceremonies, warfare, the planting and harvesting of crops, and, most dramatically, the rituals of sacrifice. Musicians and dancers trained for years, not just to entertain, but to channel divine energies. Some instruments were so sacred that only priests or nobles could play them. A wrong note could be more than embarrassing. It could be an affront to the gods. Sacrifice, a central pillar of Aztec religion, was choreographed to a soundtrack of drums and flutes. As hearts were offered to the rising sun, the music didn't seek to comfort. It was there to activate, to guide the souls of the departed, and to fuel the engines of creation. In these moments, music was not an accessory to ritual, it was the ritual. Despite the fall of these ancient civilizations, their music hasn't vanished into silence. Instead, it lingers in the rhythms of living traditions, in the design of instruments still played today, and in the cultural DNA of entire continents. Ancient music wasn't meant to be frozen in sheet music or trapped in dusty recordings. It was alive, passed from hand to hand, sung mouth to mouth, and remembered in the body long after the last note faded. Consider the Indian veena or the Chinese guqin, not just artifacts behind glass but living instruments, still played by musicians whose techniques trace back thousands of years. Each performance is a living conversation with the past. The player doesn't just repeat old notes, they inhabit them, channeling generations of memory and emotion. In a single pluck or bow, you might hear the same yearning or triumph once felt by a long-gone sage or empress. Across Africa, the drums continue to speak. The syncopated rhythms of the djembe and the call and response of the griots echo back to times before borders and written records. In the Americas, the breathy song of the Andean siku and the powerful rumble of powwow drums among indigenous nations still carry the voices of ancestors. Some instruments are direct descendants, others are bold reinventions, but their roots are ancient, and their branches stretch into today. Even the music we hear in the West owes debts to these old traditions. The seven-note scale of ancient Mesopotamia laid the foundation for modern harmony. Theorists in Greece dissected modes and intervals, feeding ideas into Christian chants, classical music, and the very instruments we strum and blow today. The lyre became the lute, and eventually the guitar. The double-reed aulos inspired the oboe and bassoon. Every time a modern orchestra tunes up, it's echoing a conversation that started thousands of years ago. But perhaps the most powerful legacy of all is the purpose behind ancient music. It wasn't written to fill stadiums or to top charts. It was the thread that wove together birth and death, planting and harvest, war and peace, love and mourning. Music was healing, ritual and resistance. It was a way for communities to survive, to remember, and sometimes to transcend. Even now, in a world flooded with digital sound, ancient music reminds us that song can still be sacred, that rhythm can still carry memory, and that melody might just be a bridge between worlds. The voices of our ancestors haven't been silenced, they're just waiting for us to listen. So next time you hear a sitar's drone, a drum's heartbeat, or a haunting flute, pause for a moment. You might just be hearing the same echoes that once shaped empires, comforted warriors, and summoned gods. The songs of the past are all around us. All we have to do is listen.